everyone and welcome. Today we are going to make this abstract intuitive painting. With abstract I mean that we're mainly going to focus on shapes and colors. And by intuitive I mean that we're going to paint and draw whatever we feel like in that moment. So each artwork will end up with a unique look, and that's what makes this intuitive art process so much fun. I'll take you step by step along on my journey and explain my process in as much detail as I can. And I hope you'll have fun creating this abstract piece together with me. I'm using watercoloring paper with a weight of 300 GSM, and the dimensions are 12 by 16 centimeters. The size doesn't really matter that much. Simply pick a size that you feel comfortable working with. I've chosen 2 flat brushes and 2 round brushes in different sizes. In hindsight, I didn't use the round brushes, but maybe you want to. Just follow your intuition. Of course, we need clean water, and this is a little paint cloth that I made from an old towel that you can simply throw in the washing machine. I'll also be using this palette to put my paint on. This is actually a bottom from an old plastic shopping bag, but you can use any kind of packaging you have. And lastly, I'll be using this old piece of paper to put underneath my painting for when I'm painting the edges. And now it's time to pick our colors. This is a color wheel, and you can see here the warm colors from warm purple to warm yellow, and then from cool yellow to cool purple. Our painting really comes alive when we choose colors that are on the same side of the color wheel and then pick one color that's on the opposite. So for example, I've chosen red, orange, yellow and pink, and my opposite color is going to be blue. But for example, you can also choose to work with greens and blues and then use your opposite or complementary color of orange or red. Just choose the colors that you feel like working with today. And lastly, I'll be using black and white. You'll see later on how these 2 colors really make the colors of your painting pop and make it seem more vivid. Alright, then it's now time to finally start painting. Take a close look at the colors you've chosen and start with the darkest color. For me, that's red. Now I'm putting down a tiny bit of paint on my palette. You don't really need that much because you can always grab more. Next, I'm putting paint on my big flat brush on both sides. Then I start painting. I'm putting down little stripes of color, which in the end look like little squares. And I'm not really thinking about where I'm putting them. I'm just following my intuition. I'm simply painting the little squares wherever I feel like putting them. And sometimes I just take a moment to look at my painting, and then my intuition will tell me where to put the next square. There is no right or wrong. In the end, our painting will consist of many layers that will form one cohesive artwork. And here you'll see me using the old piece of paper to make sure the table doesn't get dirty when I'm painting the edges. And it is important to include the edges because it helps to bring your painting more to life. And maybe you'll have an old newspaper or some other kind of protective layer under your painting, and in that case you don't really need this old piece of paper. Here you can see that I've actually run out of paint. I'm adding just a little bit more because my intuition tells me that I'm not quite finished. So I'll keep adding squares until I'm happy with the result. The benefit of only using a little bit of paint each time is that you waste less and that you get a nice thin layer on your piece of paper, which means that it dries quickly. You will also notice that some of the squares are far from perfect, especially here when I'm running out of paint. But that's okay, because like I said, this painting is going to consist of many layers in the end, so you won't notice this anymore at all. As you can see, I've now once again run out of paint, and my intuition tells me that I've got enough squares for now, so I'm start by cleaning my brush. And I'm also using my paint cloth to wipe the paint off my palette, which is easy right now because the paint is still wet. I then tidy up a bit more. I always like doing this while I'm painting. It gives the paint a little bit of time to dry and it keeps my table nice and clean. Lastly, I'm drying my brush and then I'm ready for the next color. So I'm continuing with the orange now, and I'm doing the exact same things as I did with the red. I put down a little bit of paint and I just put the squares wherever my intuition tells me. Sometimes they overlap with the red and sometimes they don't. And as you can see, I also make sure to paint the edges again. Once I'm happy with my orange squares, I clean my brush and my palette and I move on to yellow. And as you can see, I'm repeating the exact same steps as with the red and the orange. I make sure to paint the edges as well, and some of the colors will overlap. Just follow your intuition and do whatever feels right for you. Remember what I said, there is no right or wrong. Now that I've finished with my pink, I'm moving on to my small flat brush and I'm going to add an extra layer by using the same colors again, so red, orange, yellow and pink. With this layer I'm going to try to get rid of as much white space as I can, while also making sure that the little squares overlap. By repeating all these steps with a smaller brush, it means that we're creating more layers in our painting, which will give it more depth in the end. I'm still following my intuition in placing the little squares. Sometimes I will stop for a moment and then I will just feel where I want to place the next one. And because we've already put so much color down on our painting, you will see that the squares will overlap with other colors or sometimes even with the same color. And whenever I don't have enough paint on my palette, I just grab a little bit extra. And most of the time I'll just keep going until all the paint is finished. And once I'm happy with the amount of squares I've put down, I'll just clean my palette and brush and move on to the next color. It also happens sometimes that I have too much paint on my palette and my brush, and I kind of feel like I'm finished with all of the squares that I want to make. In that case, I just wipe off the excess paint on a different piece of paper that I'll then be able to use for a next painting project. Alright, so now we're finished with our layers and it's time to let the painting dry for a bit because we're going to work with the complementary color now. When you mix warm and cool colors together, either on your painting or in your paint water, you'll create a kind of brownish grayish color, which is not very nice. So while our painting dries, we clean our brushes and get some fresh paint water, so we're ready for our complementary color. Now it's time to take a close look at the beautiful layers that we've created. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. So it's time to start working with our opposite or complementary color. Because I've used warm colors, I've chosen blue as my complementary color. I've decided to only use my small brush with this color because it gives more detail. I'm doing the exact same thing as I did with all the other colors. I make sure they overlap, I try to fill up the white spaces, and I also include the edges. And as you may already see, this opposite color creates a lot of depth in your painting, which makes it come more to life. I've popped the music back on so you can just enjoy and watch how I create this final layer of paint. And just like with all the other colors, you keep on going until you're happy with the result. I quite like how mine looks right now. It almost looks like I've got some kind of confetti explosion going on my page. And now it's time to start stenciling with black and white using everyday materials. I've got some bubble wrap, an empty tape roll, and I'm using an old card. You can also use other materials, such as an empty toilet roll, or the underside of an egg carton, or you can use your fingers to make marks, or you could use the round brush, for example, to make shapes like circles and squares and stripes and whatever you want. I'm starting with applying some paint on my bubble wrap. Just make sure to do it carefully, don't press too hard because otherwise you will break the bubbles. You might have to apply 2 or 3 layers until you're happy with the amount of paint you've got on your bubbles. And now we're ready to stencil. Now gently pressing the bubble wrap on my painting. I'm doing this very carefully so the bubbles don't burst, but also to make sure that I get a nice imprint from the bubbles instead of just a big blob of paint. I will keep repeating this process until I'm happy with the amount of bubbles that I've got on my painting. And as you can see, I've made sure to place my white bubbles in 3 different spots on my painting. Research has shown that our eyes automatically create visual triangles from patterns that we see. And these visual triangles make our brain happy, which will automatically make our painting look prettier. As I'm continuing to place the bubbles on my painting, you can see that I'm keeping to 3 different areas, making sure they overlap. Here you can see it, 1, 2, and 3. And I am also making sure that my 3 groups touch the edge of my paper. I'm now going to continue with my empty tape roll. I'm carefully placing it on the edge of my paint, stenciling it up and down, turning it around until everything is covered with paint. And it looks like this. As I'm stenciling, I'm again making sure that I include the edges and that the stenciled circles overlap each other, just like with the bubble wrap. And I'm also making sure they overlap with the bubbles that I've just made. By connecting the marks with each other and with the edge of the paper, they feel more grounded and not like they're just floating around on the page. This is more pleasing to the eyes, which makes our brain happier and our painting look prettier. Similarly, our brains like odd numbers. So where I made 3 groups of bubbles, I'm now making 5 groups of circles. Now I realize it might seem a bit counterintuitive to give you all these rules to follow, while the plan is to make an intuitive painting where you just do whatever you feel like. However, you'll notice that the more you paint, the more they become second nature and you don't even think about it anymore. And now it's time to start stenciling with the card. I make sure that the edge is covered and I place it on my paper. I'm again starting from the edge and I'm choosing 3 or 5, whatever you feel like, different places. And I'll continue stenciling with my card until I'm happy with how my painting looks. Just follow your intuition. Maybe you'll only want to stencil a few, or maybe you want to do like loads and loads of them. Doesn't matter as long as you do what feels right for you. As you may have noticed, I put quite a bit of paint down on my palette because I wasn't sure how much I was going to use. But here we can also prevent wasting any paint by putting the leftovers on a separate piece of paper that we can then use as a starting point for another painting in the future. Because we finished with the white and want to continue with the black, it's important that we clean our materials to prevent the white and black from mixing and turning into grey. For this I'm using wet wipes, but you can also use a running tap, for example, as long as you're very careful and make sure you don't burst any of the bubbles. I'm starting with wiping down the bubbles with my wet wipe. It may look like I'm pressing down very hard, but I'm really not. Don't worry, you'll develop a feel for it. And I'm then using my dry cloth to kind of dry them off. Don't worry if they're not completely dry, it doesn't matter. And now we're ready for the next color. So now we're going to do the exact same thing that we did with the white, only this time with black. So now I'm pressing down the bubbles on the paper, and you might be able to see a bit better how beautiful the impressions of the bubble wrap are. And I'll keep repeating these steps until my intuition tells me that I have finished. I then immediately clean my bubble wrap. This is important because acrylic paint is essentially liquid plastic, so once it dries you won't be able to reuse it. As you can see, I've sped up the video a little bit, but I'm doing the exact same thing like I did with the white stenciling. I'm grouping them into 5 areas, making sure they overlap with the other stenciling and making sure that they touch the edges. And this is how my painting is looking so far. You can really see how the black and white makes the colors come more to life, and how all those different layers have come together and are forming one beautiful background. Once your painting is properly dry, we can move on to the next layer. I'll now be using 2 acrylic paint pens with a thicker tip and 2 gel pens with a fine tip. For the purpose of this tutorial, I've chosen to use as few pens as possible. But if you have more pens or want to use other color pens, please feel free to do so. The only thing that matters here is that you create a painting that you are happy with. So just follow your own intuition and choose any pen that you like. As you can see, I've chosen to start working with my white thick pen. These acrylic paint pens, it's very important that you shake them very well before use, and then on a separate piece of paper press down the nib a couple of times. This ensures that the paint starts flowing beautifully. You will also notice that at some point the paint will stop flowing. This simply means that the nib of your pen has run out of paint. All you have to do then is shake your pen well and press the nib down on a separate piece of paper until the paint starts flowing again. But how do I actually go about creating this final layer? I keep looking at my painting and listening to what my intuition tells me to do next. And I'm also using the previous layers to find my inspiration. So for example, here you see me coloring in some of the spaces that I've created with the previous layer of stenciling. And sometimes I really don't know what to do next, but that's okay. Sometimes we just get a little bit stuck. That happens. Sometimes I'll step away from my painting for a little bit, or I close my eyes and take a couple of deep breaths before I continue. And it also helps sometimes to turn my paper around, just to get some new perspective. I will also constantly check if I'm happy with the balance of my colors on my painting. For example, I really felt like I had too many black bubbles, so I've decided to paint a few of them white. A really neat trick hereby is to squint your eyes and look through your eyelashes. This will help you see the contrast of your painting much better. You can try it out for yourself and see if it works for you. Here you can see that I'm repeating my chosen pattern in 3 different places again. This will help our eyes to create those visual triangles again, and in turn makes our brain happy when we're looking at our painting. I feel like I've finished with the white for now, and I'm going to continue with black. Because I'm using the pen for the first time, just like with the white pen, I shake it well and then press down a nib so I get a nice flow of paint. This class took me about 2 hours to make, so as you can see, I've sped up the video again. If you want to take a closer look at something, you can always press pause, or you can use the video buttons to play it at a slower speed. The most important thing is to do whatever feels right for you. Maybe you want to draw a line here, maybe you want to color that section in. It's all good, just follow your intuition. It might be a little bit difficult to try and copy what I'm doing because this is an intuitive painting. This means that even if I use the exact same materials on a different day, I will end up with a completely different painting. This is because you're just painting whatever you feel like in that particular moment. And this can also be influenced by how we're feeling. So maybe we feel very happy, or maybe we're a little bit sad or just tired. This will all influence the outcome of our painting. So what I'm actually trying to say by all this is that there's no right or wrong way when we're making this kind of intuitive painting. So really all you need to do is make sure that you are enjoying the process and that you like the final painting. As you may have noticed, I keep switching between pens. I use the ones with the thicker nibs to color in larger areas, and I'm using the pens with the finer nibs for the more detailed work. And as I'm drawing, I constantly try to keep applying the rule of the visual triangles. Earlier you saw me create these lines with these kind of tiny bubbles at the end. And here I'm making my second one, and later on you'll see me making the third one. This rule of three can also come in very handy when you're stuck and you don't know what to draw next, because repeating a pattern gives your brain a moment to pause, and maybe that will give you some new and fresh ideas. You can also use your paint pens to color in bigger areas, just like I'm doing here. Up until now, I've kind of used the previous layers as my inspiration, mostly by filling in different areas. But we can also use our paint pens to create a whole new layer. You may, for example, choose to make rectangles or triangles or circles like I'm doing here. This is also a helpful trick for when you want to cover up parts of your painting that you don't like as much, like I did with that circle on the edge of my painting just now. You can also use circles to fill up some empty spaces that you may have in your painting, just like I'm doing here. I'll keep on drawing circles until I'm happy with the result. So I'll keep going until I've covered up all the areas that I'm less happy with, And I filled up all the empty spaces. And again, you can squint with your eyes and look through your eyelashes to see if you're happy with the contrast of your chosen pattern. Because I've been using my white pen a lot, you can see that the paint in the nib is almost gone and that you kind of get a watery kind of white that is not as opaque anymore. I keep shaking my pen and pushing down the nib, but because the paint is still wet, it's kind of hard to create a beautiful opaque layer. I fix this by going over it again later on when the paint is fully dry. And as you can see, I keep following my own rules. So I've made an odd number of circles, and I've also made sure that some of the circles touch the edges. And as you can see, I've created two kind of Christmassy sort of baubles. And I want to complete my visual triangle again, so I'm now going to make my third one. You can also always add more to patterns that you've already drawn before. For example, you can see that I initially only drew one circle, but it felt a bit flat to me, so I decided to add some squiggly circles to make it a bit more whimsical. You can also see that I initially drew thin black lines around my big white circles to make them stand out a bit more. But after looking at my painting a few times, I really felt that they weren't standing out enough, so I'm going over them again with my thick pen this time. This really shows that with this kind of painting you can just keep adding layers and changing things until you're happy. And for me, this is really one of the joys of intuitive painting. I can always change things and add things and just enjoy the process. Now I'm going to make little spiral patterns in my painting. If you also want to make this pattern, maybe you can practice first on a separate piece of paper. As you can see, I'm going really slowly and I'm starting in the middle, making bigger and bigger circles in one continuous line. And don't worry if they're not perfect in the beginning, just keep on practicing and having fun. And my paintings are never perfect either. As you can see here, my pen slipped a little and it created a kind of wonky line. I tried to go with it and just continued with the lines, but in the end I'm still not very happy with how it looks. But that is also okay, just embrace the imperfection, because in the end there'll be so much to see in our painting that you won't even notice it anymore. During the painting process, I'll often pause for a moment and look at my painting from a further distance. This helps me to see what I want to do next. During these moments, I'll try to listen carefully to my intuition, and that way I often notice that my attention is drawn to the area that I want to work on. Also be aware of the fact that with paint pens and gel pens it can take up to a minute before they're really dry. As you can see here, I didn't pay close enough attention and I went with my hand through the wet gel pen. You can try to prevent this from happening by turning your paper and making sure that your hand is in a dry area, just like you see me do all the time. And if it happens anyway, there are usually two solutions. You can wait for the area to properly dry and then fix it. So in this case, I could paint my circle white again and then fill it in with the pattern. But if it doesn't really bother you, just like in this case with me, you can also decide to just leave it as it is. Because in the end, our goal here is to have fun and to follow our intuition, and not to create the most perfect, best, beautiful, amazing, wonderful painting ever. I had had so much fun making my white circles that I decided to make some black ones as well. Another reason for that is that I felt that my painting had a bit too much white now, so I decided to bring back the balance by making the smaller black circles. I'm using the circles to hide the parts that I don't like as much, And I'm again making sure that I touch the edges and that I have an odd number. I wanted to talk a bit about where I get my ideas from, such as for this pattern. This pattern actually came from an animation that was shown on the news one night. So patterns are literally everywhere to be found. Just take a good look around you. You might be wearing a t-shirt with an interesting pattern. Or maybe your duvet cover, or your curtains, or your tea mug have interesting shapes on them. I once even copied a pattern that I'd seen on a wallpaper in a television show. You can also find nice patterns on food packages, for example, or you can search the internet for doodles. And of course, nature can also be a beautiful source of inspiration. So see if you can pay extra attention the next time you're out in nature. For example, if you look at the circles on the edges of my painting, you can see they kind of look like tree rings. And you will notice that the more ideas you get from the world around you, and the more you practice to draw them, the easier it becomes to create little patterns for your paintings and drawings. And slowly you'll start discovering which patterns are your favorite, and you can use them again and again. Now, in looking at my painting, I noticed I had two areas where I made this kind of line drawing, and I wanted to make my third one. I've slowed down the speed of the video so you can take a closer look at what I'm actually doing. I'm starting off with a few horizontal lines, and I keep adding diagonal lines in both directions, and I'm repeating the pattern until my shape is full. And the cool thing is that you can apply this to almost any shape you want. Just give it a go if you'd like. And I'm now starting to get the feeling that my painting is just about completed. So I'm now pausing for a moment and taking a closer look at all the details of my painting to see if there's anything I want to add still. And by doing this, we'll also give our painting a chance to dry a bit more before we decide whether we were going to continue or not. Looking at my painting, I decided I wanted to add a border to it to frame my artwork. I don't always do this, but sometimes it really feels like it brings my painting more to life when I add a border. So I invite you to take a close look at your painting and feel for yourself if you want to add a border like I'm doing or not. And it doesn't have to look like my border. You can, for example, use a thick border or a thin border or a straight border or a curvy border, and you can choose any color that you feel fits with your painting. In this case, I've chosen to go with black, because black is a contrasting color that really makes your other colors come more to life. And remember, just do whatever feels right for you. And now we're almost done. I always like adding a kind of whimsical element to my painting as a final touch. It's just a small element that you might not immediately notice when you look at the painting, but when you take a closer look, they'll just jump out at you. Sometimes I like to hide little hearts everywhere in my artwork, or I choose a word or a quote that really inspires me in that moment. And today I had this song in my head about three little birds sitting on a doorstep, so that's what I decided to do. So as you can see, music can also be another great source of inspiration for your artwork. I hope you had as much fun as I had in making this abstract intuitive painting. And of course, you can make this painting over and over again with different colors and different patterns. Bye bye for now, and I hope you have a great day.